So I'm so delighted to pass now to our first speaker, Sheila Jeffries.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to talk today about why the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights was created 2 years ago. When CEDAW, the Women's Convention, was adopted in 1979, it was firmly understood that women's oppression was based on sex. CEDAW states that discrimination against women is any discrimination based upon sex. Gender is not mentioned in the convention, and the word was not much used by feminists at that time. The term sex role stereotypes was used in the convention to mean the restrictions and expectations culturally enforced upon women on the basis of sex. CEDAW says that states parties should seek to abolish them because they are the justification for women's oppression. Gradually, however, the word gender came to be used more often in women's human rights work as a substitute for the term sex role stereotypes, but it had the same meaning. At the same time that the word gender was taking over from sex in human rights work, a development took place that now seriously threatens women's rights as human rights. This was a movement for transgender rights. The transgender rights activists were overwhelmingly what were previously called transvestites, men who were, according to sexologists, the scientists of sex, masochistically sexually excited by wearing women's clothes and women's body parts and going out in public pretending to be women. These men asserted that they had innate female gender identities and should have the right to express those identities in all public and women's spaces. Instead of wanting to abolish sex stereotypes, as feminists did, and as CEDAW called for, they fashioned identities based on sex stereotypes because these were masochistically exciting for them. They called these gender identities, but they should more accurately be called sex stereotype identities. Transvestites in the US drew up a bill of transgender rights in the mid-1990s, and they initiated a campaign nationally and internationally for their gender or sex stereotype rights. The transvestites needed to hide their sexual motivations because that might mean that they were not seen as an appropriate rights-bearing category. Therefore, they created a gender ideology, which asserts that people can be born into the wrong body and acquire the wrong sexed brain. The ideology has been widely adopted and was used to create an industry of the transgendering of children, as if children could somehow be born with a body that was wrong because it did not suit their gender. The importance of recruiting children to their cause is that it establishes that the men's behavior is nothing to do with sex, because children are seen as innocent. The transvestites campaigned to get the medical profession to accept that they were really women, and not just acting out of a sexual motivation. They engaged in decades of campaigning, including many threats and much bullying, to persuade the sexologists to invent a new category of persons, men who were really women, even though the vast majority kept their penises and often their beards. The diagnosis was invented of gender identity disorder, and then this was changed because even that was seen as negative to gender dysphoria. Some sexologists, like Ray Blanchard and Michael Bailey, have never accepted that these men have innate gender identities and describe in detail the form that the men's sexual paraphilia takes, such as not just wanting to wear women's clothes, but also to change their bodies temporarily or permanently to acquire women's body parts, and to engage in behaviors that they think make them women, such as knitting. Over the last 2 decades, these men have campaigned for their gender rights. They have succeeded in getting protection of their identities into the law in many countries, so that they have the right to enter women's toilets, prisons, sports, shelters. They have worked behind the scenes to change policy so that gender identity is now taught in schools, and thousands of children are being transgendered by drugs and surgery. Companies and organizations have been trained to introduce gender identity policies. Language has been changed in the health services and many other areas so that sex can no longer be mentioned. The effect of all this campaigning and organization by transgender activists has been to severely endanger women's human rights. The language of gender and the idea that there is something called gender identity, which is connected to lesbian and gay rights, has broadly infiltrated the landscape of rights work. Gender identity does not, in fact, have anything to do with lesbian and gay rights. Lesbians and gay men are not attracted to each other because of gender or sex stereotypes, but on the basis of sex. They are same-sex attracted. Major NGOs have promoted the gender ideology at the UN. It has become harder and harder for women to work on behalf of women and protect the rights that we do have. The Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights was created because a group of women in the UK became aware of the very considerable threat this gradual erosion of the category of sex posed to women's rights. We were determined to mount a campaign to protect and promote women's rights against the intrusion of men with sexual paraphilias into the category women. We wrote the declaration and set up the Women's Human Rights Campaign to promote it. A new women's liberation movement is building in response to the threat posed by the advance of men's gender identity rights. It's an international movement. We hope that it will become as powerful and effective as the movement that made CEDAW, the Women's Convention, happen in the first place.